I am Emma Simpson, and I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon to talk about one of the biggest issues of our time, climate change. I'm sure that when you heard those words, many of your reactions would have been to groan. Over the past several years, you will have been inundated with data, opinions, pictures, policies about climate change. It's overwhelmed us. It's been the basis for films, jokes, TV shows, and most recently, some very controversial policy from one of the most volatile US administrations in history. I'm not going to gratify Mr. Trump by conceding to discuss the reality of climate change. It is happening, and it's happening now. What I will talk about is who that change is happening to, and what we must do to create a climate future that truly is for everyone. The graph that I've just brought up behind me is the Global Land-Ocean Temperature Index. Produced by NASA, this graph charts the land surface temperature relative to average year means. It's considered one of our Earth's vital signs, and one of the measures most frequently used to convince people of climate change. In the past 17 years since 2000, it's contained the 10 hottest years on record. This has formed the basis of the narrative in which we understand and talk about climate change, and it has done for the last 200 years. Data-driven, scientific. It's vitally important, and it is also simply not enough. There's an idea in how we talk about climate change that humans are the bad guys, and the Earth is a fragile entity that will never recover from the wrongdoings of our race. That of all the things to be affected by climate change, the seas, the polar bear, biodiversity, the forests, we are simply not one of those things. Have a look at this advertisement from the Devon Wildlife Trust, a conservation charity in the southwest of England. The tagline reads, "We can adapt, can they?" I'm not going to suggest that a hedgehog is going to buy scuba diving gear or turn into a fish anytime soon. But what I would challenge is the confidence of that statement. We can adapt. The human ability to adapt is no longer an evolutionary process. Some scientists would argue that human evolution is simply no longer happening, or at least not in a way that we understand. Instead, human adaptability is driven by material wealth. With access to money, with access to commercial goods, you can have private healthcare when public sectors are down. You can afford the best flood defenses for your home. You can afford quick and efficient transport. You can afford to live sustainably. Essentially, you can pay to anticipate and to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change. This affordable anticipation is a very uniquely human trait, but it is not available to everyone. Have you ever watched a disaster movie or a horror movie and thought, why do you not just move house? If you live in a town that is so badly plagued by demons that look like clowns, or if you live in a beach area that you know is prone to storm surges, why do you not just move? The reality is that as much as we want to believe that human adaptability is based on creativity or determination or ingenuity, what it is based on is your access to wealth. If you live in poverty, if you're underprivileged, it is much harder to simply move if you don't have the promise of a safe home elsewhere, of a community that will look out for you, or any job prospects. So what is the solution to this problem? Do we just make it so that everyone has enough money to buy sustainable goods and, if necessary, to flee the area? We just make sure everyone has a lot of cash. Maybe. It's very alluring as an idea that if we simply work hard enough, we will earn enough money to survive. And that means avoiding threats like drought, desertification, fuel poverty, disastrous climate events. But that economic narrative suggests that people are poor because they don't work hard enough, and that the people with the most money work the hardest and are the most important. It's because of this economic model that we've ended up with a climate narrative that says, oh, we'll be fine. We have access to money and technology. These polar bears won't be, though. It's not good enough, and we know that it leaves people behind. How about another idea? A second solution. How about we give everyone the same amount of money, redistribute the wealth, or we make sure that everyone has enough to give them that safety from climate danger? We might be getting somewhere with that. That certainly addresses the issue of a wage disparity. But looking at economic solutions does not get to the fundamental heart of the problem. We must ask ourselves not just who is poor and who is not, but why some people are poor where others are not, and what other vulnerabilities there are that mean that we might be at risk of a catastrophic climate event. This leads us on to the third solution, and I would argue the best: intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term coined by civil rights advocate Kimberly Crenshaw, who's just behind me, and it was coined to describe the experiences of any one individual's different identities that overlap and interact, and the related systems of oppression, power, discrimination, and domination that relate to those identities. Any one of us is made up of several parts, and they interact. I'm a white person. I'm feminine presenting. I come from a largely middle-class family, and I'm also queer. My queerness is likely to put me at risk in certain societies and certain locations, but my whiteness, my lack of any visible disability, and my class all mean that other forms of discrimination are non-existent for me, or that other forms of discrimination are softened. I have a huge amount of social privilege and power. If you were to compare me to, say, a queer person of color who is living with a visible disability, they had to put up with multiple different systems of oppression all happening at the same time, and are comparatively in a much scarier position of risk when you look at it against mine. But what does that have to do with climate change? What does that have to do with events like this, which is Hurricane Katrina? Surely, if the climate is going to change, that will affect everyone, all people. And surely that's regardless of race, faith, disability, gender, or sexuality. The sad truth is that climate change does discriminate on the basis of identity. And intersectionality helps us frame those issues in a different way. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005. The news stories that ran at the time spoke not just of the bad weather, but of looting, pillaging, murder, and rape committed by the explicitly named two-thirds African-American majority of the city. CNN's spokesperson Paul Azan spoke of bands of rapists going from block to block. This image of the city as a hell dominated by violent African-American women was so pervasive that the then governor of Louisiana, Kathleen Blanco, coordinated with the city mayor to stop rescue efforts in black residential areas. Instead, she moved those efforts to private commercial property. She sent the National Guard into the city, saying, "I have one message for these hoodlums. These troops know how to shoot and kill, and they are more than willing to do so, and I expect they will." She was right. A large number of black people were shot and killed by the National Guard, by the New Orleans Police Department, and by vigilante gangs of white men, who would later go on to say that they were just defending property. This is racism. Racism produced a series of rumors about a predominantly working class, low-income, black community, and used it to justify violence. What is true about New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina is that the Bush administration abandoned the city. Aid did not come at all in some areas, or where it did not come quickly enough. People were left without access to sanitation, water, food, or shelter. What is absolutely not true is those rumors of violence, of rape, of crisis. It is extremely hard to imagine that in a largely white, middle, or upper class area, that those rumors would ever have come to be seen on the news. It is also hard to imagine that in a white, upper class area, aid would have not reached them in time, that they would have been left without adequate support to help the refugees of a climate crisis. So what does that have to do with you? That rather depressing story of institutional racism. Intersectionality gives us a window through which to look to address this idea of a trickle-down social justice system that says because it affects all of us, the people with the most resources at the top, they'll look after us. They'll invent, they'll innovate, and we'll all see the benefit of their wealth, their social power. That's simply not true. What intersectionality does is help us stop people from falling through the gaps. It helps us identify who's most at risk. We know that that is largely poor people, largely disabled people of color within the LGBT community, and those living at high-risk areas in the global south. All those different social and cultural identities come together to produce big risk, not just because of things like institutional racism, but because of how they interact with having no money, being oppressed or disowned because of your sexuality. That produces a nexus of risk and danger. So I'm going to ask you to do 4 things, to take all that information and then apply it to your own lives. The first is to listen. You're on a university campus. Interact with a Disabled Action Society. Go to an LGBT society's meeting. Ask if it's okay for you to sit in the back and simply listen. Understand what other people are going through and understand how it relates to either your own struggles or to the wider struggle of a changing climate. Don't talk in those spaces. Simply listen. The second thing is to talk about people. For a long time, we've spoken about polar bears and melting ice caps. We've not talked about the human impact. That graph I showed you way back, the Global Land Ocean Temperature Index, shows nothing of the human impact of climate change. So if you're running a campaign on your university campus, in your workplace, in your community, rather than talking about polar bears, talk about people, talk about migration, food crisis, fuel poverty, and talk about who it's most likely to affect. The third step is to be critical. Let's take the example of someone's built a big new community renewable energy program. Ask, who exactly is it owned by? Who is it run by? Who has access to it? A renewable energy program is a great thing, but not if it's not accessible to everyone and not accessible to the poor. Be critical of yourself as well. We are all going through a continuous process of learning and unlearning that will likely last the rest of our lives. Be aware of the discrimination or prejudice you may carry, even if it's unconscious, and make the effort to educate yourself without asking vulnerable people to do it for you. Finally, show up. Go to the struggles of other people. Be a good ally and show solidarity. If you're a climate campaigner, if your big thing is that you care about the environment, you're passionate about recycling, go to a Black Lives Matter protest to offer support. Go to an LGBT pride rally. Those issues are deeply related to the climate, and you should know that. Go to those struggles and form those community links. Those 4 ways are just the beginning of how we can build a climate future that really does accommodate the world's many voices. Thank you.